The cavernous hearing room of the Rayburn House office building was a vessel of silence in the pre-dawn gray, holding its breath before the coming storm. Light, thin and sterile, filtered through the towering arched windows, catching dust motes. As they danced in lazy prophetic swirls over rows of empty chairs, the air was thick with the scent of old power, a blend of lemon floor polish, aged oak, and the faint papery aroma of a million forgotten documents. Marble walls, cool and impassive, reflected the muted light, their veins of gray and white, like a roadmap of the nation's fractures. High above, the ornate plaster ceiling seemed to absorb all sound, creating a pressurized quiet that felt heavier than noise. At the center of the vast, curved dais, under the stoic gaze of a portrait of a long-dead statesman, sat Chairman Alistair Cain. He had been there for nearly an hour, a solitary figure in a perfectly tailored dark suit. He wasn't reviewing notes. His preparation was cellular, a state of being. His hands, long and fastidious, rested flat on the polished mahogany, one on either side of a single, slender file folder. Inside that folder, bound by a simple rubber band, was the distillation of 2 years of painstaking investigation, the document that had come to be known in hushed, anxious whispers as the Damascus Protocol. Cain's posture was an exercise in controlled stillness, not a single wasted movement. His gaze drifted from the empty witness chair to the vacant seats of the press corps, then to the public gallery, still roped off and dark. He saw, not empty space, but ghosts. The ghosts of precedent, of duty, of the institution he had sworn to uphold. He felt their weight, a pressure not on his shoulders but deep within his chest, a cold, hard knot of responsibility. He believed, with an almost religious fervor, in the sanctity of the process. The facts, laid out methodically, under the unblinking eye of the public record, would form a narrative of their own. Truth, he was convinced, had its own gravitational pull. His job was not to create it, but to clear the debris so it could be seen. The first stirrings of life began subtly. Side door hissed open, and a young aide, her face a mask of nervous energy, placed a glass of water and a sharpened pencil next to his folder. She didn't speak, just a nod of acknowledgement, a shared understanding of the day's gravity. Cain offered a faint, almost imperceptible dip of his chin in return. Soon, more followed. Clerks moved with quiet efficiency, arranging microphones, testing sound systems with soft taps that echoed like gunshots in the stillness. The press began to filter in, their movements quick and predatory. They staked out their territory, setting up laptops, checking camera angles, their hushed conversations a rising tide of speculation. They were the chorus, waiting for the tragedy to begin. Then he arrived. Congressman Jedediah Jed Stone did not enter the room. He breached it. The double doors at the rear swung open with a percussive thud, and he strode in, a phalanx of junior congressmen and grim-faced staffers in his wake. Where Cain was a study in stillness, Stone was a vortex of kinetic energy.
House.
His suit jacket was unbuttoned, his tie slightly askew, as if he'd just come from a street fight. His shoulders were broad, his gait a pugilist's roll. He didn't walk the aisle. He patrolled it, his eyes sweeping the room, taking its measure, identifying threats and allies. He clapped a colleague on the back, shared a conspiratorial whisper with another. His laughter a sharp barking sound that sliced through the reverent hush. He was a master of political theater, and this room was his stage. He ignored the dais. At first, turning his attention to the cameras, he flashed a brief, combative grin, a glint of defiance in his eyes. He was not here to participate in Cain's solemn ritual of fact-finding. He was here to dismantle it, brick by brick. He saw the entire proceeding not as an investigation, but as a coup, a silent, bloodless seizure of power by an elite he despised. His mission was not to defend the former president implicated in the protocol, but to attack the very legitimacy of his accusers. For Stone, the truth was not a destination to be reached through evidence, but a weapon to be forged in the fires of conflict. He finally ascended the dais, taking his seat at the far end from Cain. The geographic, Distance between them was a physical manifestation of the ideological chasm that separated them. Kane represented the cool, rational, procedural heart of the institution. Stone represented its passionate, populist, and increasingly defiant soul. For a long moment, they did not look at each other. Kane remained focused on the empty space. Before him, a man meditating before battle. Stone busied himself, spreading his papers out with exaggerated, almost dismissive gestures. Leaning back in his chair, projecting an aura of bored contempt, the clock on the wall, a great gilded circle, ticked past the hour. The room was now full, a buzzing, expectant hive. Every seat was taken. The air crackled. Kane picked up the wooden gavel, felt impossibly heavy. He looked out at the sea of faces, the skeptical, the hopeful, the cynical, the fearful, took a slow, deep breath, held it, and brought the gavel down. The sharp crack echoed, starting pistol for a war of attrition. The room fell silent. Kane's hands moved to the slender folder. He opened it with surgical precision, did not speak of its contents, not yet. He began by outlining the rules of the committee, his voice, when it finally came, a low, even monotone that carried across the room without the aid of a microphone. He spoke of historical precedent, of constitutional duty, of the solemn oath they had all sworn. His every word was a stone being carefully placed in the foundation of a great wall of legitimacy. He was building his fortress before the siege began. Stone listened, a slight smirk playing on his lips. He let Kane finish his lengthy preamble. He allowed the chairman to believe he had established control. Then, just as Kane's hand moved toward the Damascus Protocol itself, Stone leaned forward, pressing the button on his microphone. The small red light blinked on, an angry eye. He didn't wait to be recognized. His voice, a rasping baritone, honed by 1,000 rallies, boomed through the speakers, jarring the room's carefully constructed solemnity. He wasn't addressing the chairman. He was addressing the cameras, the people watching at home. He launched into a point of order that was not a point of order at all, but a filibuster of fury. He questioned the committee's very right to exist, citing obscure bylaws and forgotten resolutions. He accused the majority staff of partisan leaks, of manufacturing a narrative in the press before a single piece of evidence had been presented. Kane sat impassive. He did not interrupt. He let the storm break over him. He knew this was Stone's opening gambit, to poison the well, to turn the proceedings into a chaotic brawl before the first punch was even thrown. The chairman's eyes, magnified slightly by his reading glasses, were fixed on Stone. He registered the feigned outrage, the rehearsed indignation, the carefully chosen words designed to inflame and divide. He saw it not as an emotional outburst, but as a calculated tactical maneuver. After 5 minutes of uninterrupted tirade, Kane calmly held up a hand. He did not raise his voice. He simply waited. Stone, momentarily out of breath, paused. In that sliver of silence, Kane spoke. He methodically, dispassionately, dismantled Stone's procedural objections one by one, citing the exact house rules that contradicted them. He was a surgeon excising a tumor, his work precise, bloodless, and devastatingly effective. For a moment, a flicker of genuine anger flashed in Stone's eyes. The frustration of a brawler whose wild swings had met only empty air. He had thrown a bomb, and Kane had calmly picked it up and diffused it. Round 1, to the chairman. Kane turned back to the folder. He slid the document out. It was surprisingly thin, just a few pages of dense typewritten text, heavily redacted. Black lines and blocks obscured vast swaths of information, leaving only tantalizing islands of words. Kane had a larger, unredacted copy placed on the projectors, its image appearing on the large screens behind him. He began to walk the committee through it. He did not interpret, did not editorialize. He simply read, his finger tracing the lines on the screen. He pointed to a date, then to a name, a foreign intelligence operative, then to a series of wire transfers originating from a shell corporation with known ties to the former administration. He connected the dots with the cold, irrefutable logic of a mathematician proving a theorem. The Damascus Protocol, as he presented it, was not a smoking gun, but a blueprint. A detailed plan for a quid pro quo of staggering audacity, the easing of sanctions on a rogue state in exchange for fabricated intelligence that could be used against a domestic political rival. A hush fell over the room. The press corps furiously typed, their fingers flying across keyboards. This was the heart of the matter. The raw, ugly truth of it laid bare. Kane paused, letting the weight of the information settle. He had built his case, laid his foundation. Now, the burden of proof shifted. Stone's microphone light blinked on again. This time, his approach was different. He was no longer the raging bull. He was the cunning prosecutor. He didn't attack the document itself. He attacked the man presenting it. He began slowly, almost conversationally. He brought up a television interview Kane had given 2 years prior during the early stages of a separate investigation. Quoted Kane's own words, in which the chairman had claimed to have seen evidence of a conspiracy that had not yet been fully substantiated. Stone twisted the statement, reframing it not as a prosecutor's confidence in his case, but as the lie of a partisan zealot. He built his narrative carefully. Alistair Kane, the man of principle, the solemn defender of the institution, was, in fact, a serial fabulist. A man so blinded by his hatred for the former president that he saw conspiracies where there were none. He wove a tapestry of insinuation, connecting Kane to anonymous sources, 2 leaks in the press, to every unsubstantiated rumor that had ever graced a cable news chyron. He wasn't trying to disprove the Damascus Protocol. He was trying to disqualify the judge. How can we trust a single word of this document? Stone's voice dripped with theatrical disbelief. When it is presented by a man with a documented history of misleading the American people, a man who has time and again promised mountains of evidence only to deliver molehills of innuendo? Kane felt a cold prickle of anger. It was an old attack, a tired talking point, but in this context it was brutally effective. Stone was not engaging with the facts on the screen. He was putting Kane himself on trial. The cameras, Kane knew, were now focused on him, hungry for a reaction. A flash of temper, a defensive stammer. Any sign that the arrow had found its mark. He forced himself to remain perfectly still. He let the accusation hang in the air, festering. He stared back at Stone, his expression unreadable. Inside, his mind raced. This was the crux of their war. Kane believed the evidence was paramount. Stone believed the narrator was everything. In the modern political arena, who was right? Kane's entire strategy rested on the faith that institutions and facts still mattered more than personalities and performance. He felt that faith being tested in real time, he finally responded, his voice even colder than before. He refused to defend himself. To do so would be to accept Stone's premise, to step into the ring and brawl on his terms. Instead, he deflected back to the evidence. He pointed to a specific transaction in the protocol. A transfer of funds to a bank in Zurich. He asked Stone directly to explain it, to offer an alternative theory for why a company controlled by a political ally of the president would be sending millions of dollars to an account linked to a foreign spy. He was trying to drag Stone back to the solid ground of fact, but Stone was a creature of the swamp. He wouldn't be drawn out. He waved a dismissive hand. Documents can be forged, Stone shot back. Context can be fabricated. We have seen this committee, under this chairman's leadership, abuse its power before. Why should today be any different? The day wore on, a grueling trench war of procedure and personality. Kane would present a piece of evidence, a phone log, an email, a flight manifest. Stone would counter not by refuting it, but by attacking its provenance. Questioning the motives of the investigators who found it, or launching into a fresh diatribe against Kane's character. The room became a theater of attrition. The substance of the Damascus Protocol was slowly being buried under an avalanche of procedural wrangling and personal invective. Kane felt a growing sense of despair, a quiet fear that he had misjudged the nature of the battle. He had brought a rapier to a knife fight. His meticulous, logical presentation was being bludgeoned by Stone's relentless, chaotic aggression. The narrative he could feel was slipping away from him. story was no longer did the former administration commit a crime. It was becoming, is the investigation a legitimate exercise or a partisan witch hunt? And in that debate, Stone was winning as the afternoon light began to fade. Casting long, distorted shadows across the room, a new player was brought into the drama. Kane announced his intention to call a witness for the following day, a mid-level State Department official, a career diplomat named Anya Sharma, whose signature appeared on a key travel authorization related to the protocol. Her testimony, Kane believed, could provide the human element, the direct, irrefutable link that documents alone could not. Stone's reaction was immediate and visceral. He exploded. This, he thundered, was witness tampering. A career civil servant, being dragged before the cameras to be coerced into validating the chairman's predetermined narrative. He demanded to see all of the preliminary interviews the committee staff had conducted with Ms. Sharma. He demanded a list of every question Kane intended to ask. He was creating a cloud of suspicion around her before she had even set foot in the room. He was painting her not as a fact witness, but as a political pawn. Kane denied the requests, citing committee rules on witness preparation. But the damage was done. Stone had planted the seed of doubt. Anya Sharma was no longer a neutral observer. She was a compromised player in Kane's game. The gavel fell to end the day's session. The sound was dull, exhausted. Kane sat for a long moment as the room emptied, the noise and energy draining away, leaving behind the same oppressive silence from the morning. But now, the silence felt different. It was not pregnant with possibility, but heavy with the weight of failure. He had presented the facts, clear and damning, and yet he felt as though he had lost. He looked across the dais at Stone, who was packing his briefcase, laughing with an aide, basking in the glow of a day's combat. Stone caught Kane's eye. He didn't smile. He just gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't a gesture of respect. It was a gesture of dominance. A clear message. You are in my world now, and in my world your rules don't apply. Kane remained long after everyone else had gone. He sat alone in the vast, empty room. The projected image of the Damascus Protocol still glowing on the screen behind him, silent testament to a truth that no one seemed to want to hear. He stared at the empty witness chair where Anya Sharma would sit tomorrow. He had intended for her to be the voice of conscience, the corroborating evidence. But Stone had already begun to turn her into a target. A cold, unwelcome thought crept into Kane's mind. His faith in the process, in the slow, methodical revelation of truth, had been the bedrock of his career. But what if that faith was misplaced? What if Stone's cynical brand of warfare was the only thing that worked anymore? To win, did he have to become the very thing he was fighting? Did he have to descend into the mud and fight on Stone's terms? The thought felt like a betrayal of everything he stood for. He looked down at his own hands, resting on the cool mahogany. For the first time that day, they felt unsteady. The battle for the Damascus Protocol was far from over, but the battle for Alistair Kane's soul had just begun. He finally switched off the projector, plunging the room into shadow. The truth of the protocol was still there, hidden in the dark, but he was no longer certain he had the right map to find it. The second day began with a palpable sense of dread. The air in the hearing room was not just tense, it was toxic. The battle lines drawn yesterday had hardened overnight into fortified trenches. The press corps was larger, their demeanor more frenzied. The previous day's clash had been front page news, not for the details of the Damascus Protocol, but for the raw, gladiatorial combat between Kane and Stone. The narrative had been set. This was a blood sport. Alistair Kane entered with the same measured calm, but a close observer would have noticed the subtle changes. The set of his jaw was harder, the lines around his eyes deeper. The knot of responsibility in his chest had been joined by a cold ball of anger. He had spent a sleepless night rereading the protocol, re-examining his strategy, wrestling with the insidious question that had taken root in his mind. How do you fight an enemy who burns the rulebook and calls the ashes victory? He had no answer, only a renewed, grim determination. Jed Stone, by contrast, arrived like a conquering hero. He moved through the room with an almost joyful belligerence, feeding off the energy he had created. He knew he had successfully shifted the terms of engagement. He wasn't just a member of the committee anymore. He was the leader of the opposition, the defender of a cause. He posed for photos, his grin wide and confident. He was no longer just attacking the process. He was embodying the rebellion against it. When the gavel fell, its sound was swallowed by the thick, charged atmosphere. All eyes turned to the side door, where the day's witness was set to enter. Anya Sharma walked in, and a collective, silent judgment seemed to fall upon her. She was a woman in her late 40s, with a face that spoke of a career spent in quiet, diligent service. She was dressed in a conservative navy suit, her hands clutching a small leather portfolio as if it were a life raft. Her eyes, wide and nervous, darted from the Klieg lights to the bank of cameras, then to the imposing dais. She was a creature of quiet hallways and classified briefings, thrust into the harshest of spotlights. Stone had done his work well. She already looked like a victim. Kane began his questioning gently. His voice was soft, reassuring. He asked her about her career, her years of service under administrations of both parties, her expertise in Middle Eastern affairs. He was attempting to build a shield of credibility around her, to establish her as a nonpartisan professional, a public servant simply doing her job. Anya Sharma's answers were quiet, her voice trembling slightly but firm. She was a professional. She would not be easily broken. Kane then guided her to the document at the heart of the matter. A travel authorization she had signed. The authorization cleared a high-ranking political appointee, a close confidant of the former president, for an unscheduled off-the-books trip to Damascus. The date of the authorization coincided perfectly with the timeline laid out in the protocol. "Ms. Sharma," Kane said, his voice resonating with practiced calm. "Can you tell the committee why this trip was not logged through standard channels?" Anya Sharma took a sip of water. The entire room leaned forward. "I was told it was a matter of extreme national security," she said, her voice gaining strength. "The request came directly from the Chief of Staff's office. The instructions were explicit. No paper trail beyond the authorization itself." "Did that strike you as unusual?" Kane pressed. "Highly unusual," she affirmed. "Unprecedented in my experience." Kane had laid his trap. He had the witness, the document, the corroboration, a direct link from the shadow world of the protocol to the highest levels of the previous administration. He had her. He felt a flicker of triumph. Then it was Stone's turn. He didn't rise. He leaned forward, his elbows on the table, creating an aura of intimate menace. He didn't look at Anya Sharma at first. He looked at a stack of papers in front of him. "Ms. Sharma," he began, his voice a low growl. "You say you're a career professional, a nonpartisan, is that correct?" "Yes, Congressman," she answered, her guard now up. "It's interesting," Stone said, picking up a sheet of paper. "Because my office did a little research, a little public record digging. Seems you've made several political donations over the years." He paused for effect. "All of them. Every single one. 2 candidates and political action committees affiliated with the chairman's party." A murmur went through the room. Kane stiffened. It was a cheap shot, but a potent one. Anya Sharma flushed. "My personal political beliefs have no bearing on my professional duties," she said, her voice tight. "Don't they?" Stone shot back, his volume rising. He held up another paper. "How about this? It's an email sent from your personal account, obtained legally through a public records request of your former university, where you were an adjunct fellow. In it, you refer to the former president as a threat to democratic norms and an unqualified charlatan." Kane's mind reeled. This was an ambush. Stone hadn't just been preparing to question her. He had been investigating her, digging for dirt, for anything he could use to assassinate her character. The email was years old, private correspondence. But in the context of this hearing, it was a weapon. Anya Sharma was speechless. She looked to Kane for help, but there was none to be given. Stone had the floor. He pressed his advantage relentlessly. He twisted her career accomplishments into a narrative of partisan ladder climbing. He painted her diligent, by-the-book nature as evidence of a deep-state bureaucrat hostile to the former administration. He wasn't questioning her testimony. He was invalidating her existence as a credible human being. "So let me get this straight," Stone said, his voice dripping with sarcasm as he addressed the cameras. "The chairman's star witness, the linchpin of his entire conspiracy theory, is a partisan operative who despises the man she is now conveniently offering testimony against. And we are supposed to believe she is an objective source?" Anya Sharma, a woman of substance and integrity, just minutes before, had been reduced to a caricature. She sat, pale and shaken. The carefully constructed shield Cain had built for her shattered into 1,000 pieces. The content of her testimony was now forgotten. The only thing that mattered was the accusation that she was biased. Cain felt a fury so pure and so hot it almost choked him. This was not a search for truth. It was a defilement. A ritualistic debasement of a public servant for political gain. He saw in that moment the abyss that had opened in their shared democracy. Stone hadn't just attacked a witness. He had attacked the very idea that a person could set aside their private views to perform a public duty. He intervened, his voice like cracking ice. He accused Stone of witness intimidation, of character assassination, of tactics unbecoming of a member of Congress. The two men locked horns directly, their voices rising, speaking over one another. The hearing descended into chaos. The gavel fell again and again, its sound lost in the cacophony of shouting. The room had become a microcosm of the nation itself. Two sides, screaming into a void, incapable of hearing anything but the sound of their own rage. The session was suspended. Anya Sharma was escorted out of the room, her face a stony mask, her reputation in tatters. Stone looked triumphant. He had not disproven a single fact, but he had won the day's war. He had demonstrated that he could destroy anyone Cain put on the stand. He had sent a clear message to any future witnesses: testify against us, and we will ruin you. That night, Cain sat in his darkened office, the city lights of Washington, D.C. twinkling below like a field of cold, distant stars. The anger had subsided, leaving behind a residue of cold, hard resolve. Stone's tactics had crossed a line. He had shown that there was no depth to which he would not sink. Cain realized his mistake had not been in his strategy, but in his estimation of his opponent. He had assumed a shared, if minimal, respect for the institution. That assumption was now gone. The rule book was burned. It was time to fight with fire. His chief counsel, a sharp, pragmatic woman named Lena, entered the office. She had a file in her hand, a file they had compiled months ago but had decided was too incendiary, too far outside the lines of a normal investigation to use. It was opposition research, not on the former president, but on Jedediah Stone himself. "It's time," Lena said, her voice quiet but firm. She placed the file on his desk. It landed with a soft, definitive thud. Cain stared at it. The file contained details of Stone's financial dealings, a pattern of real estate investments with donors, a series of conveniently timed stock trades, a foundation run by his wife that seemed to have blurred the lines between charitable work and political slush fund. There was no smoking gun, no indictment level crime. But there was a thick, greasy trail of ethical corner-cutting, of profiting from his public office in ways that were odious, not strictly illegal. To use it would be to adopt Stone's tactics, to change the subject, to attack the man, not the argument. It was everything Cain found repellent. It would mean descending to Stone's level, fighting in the mud he so clearly enjoyed, would forever taint the purity of their investigation into the Damascus Protocol. But what choice did he have? Stone had declared total war. To continue with a principled, by-the-book approach was now a form of unilateral disarmament. Anya Sharma's ordeal had proven that. He thought of her face, the look of betrayal and humiliation. As she was led from the room, a good woman, a dedicated public servant, sacrificed on the altar of Stone's ambition. The cold resolve in Cain's gut hardened into something sharper, something more dangerous. He slowly reached out and pulled the file toward him. He opened it. The pages glowed in the dim light of his desk lamp. For a moment, he saw his own reflection. In the polished surface of his desk, and the face staring back at him was not the one he recognized. The man of principle, the stoic defender of the institution, was gone. In his place was a fighter, a man preparing to do what was necessary to win. He had crossed a Rubicon in his own soul. He would use the file. He would burn Stone to the ground. The great, solemn search for truth had ended. The war had begun. The morning of the third day felt like the prelude to an execution. The news was dominated by Anya Sharma's public crucifixion and the explosive clash between the two congressmen. The Damascus Protocol itself was an afterthought. The story was Cain versus Stone, and everyone knew today would be the climax. When Alistair Cain took his seat, the change in his demeanor was palpable. The contemplative stillness was gone, replaced by a predatory focus. His eyes were not fixed on the empty space before him, but locked directly on Jed Stone at the other end of the dais. There was no pretense of collegiality left. This was personal. Stone, for his part, seemed to relish the new dynamic. He met Cain's glare with a mocking smirk. He had dragged the chairman down to his level, and he was confident he could win a fight in the dirt. The gavel fell, the sound sharp and final. Cain did not call a witness. He did not bring up the protocol. He kept the file on Stone closed on the desk in front of him. He was a hunter, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He ceded the floor to the minority, allowing them to rant, to speechify, to continue their attacks. He sat through it all, his silence a coiled spring of potential energy. He was letting Stone believe he was broken, that he had no moves left. Finally, after an hour of procedural theater, Stone himself took the microphone, intending to deliver what he clearly saw as the killing blow. He launched into a grand, sweeping monologue, a closing argument for the trial he had manufactured. He painted Cain as a failed inquisitor, his investigation a shambles, his star witness discredited. Spoke of patriotism, of witch hunts, of the courage to stand up to a corrupt establishment. He was at the peak of his rhetorical power, a demagogue in full flight. And as Stone was pontificating about ethics and integrity, about the sacred trust of public office, Cain made his move. He did not interrupt. He simply had an aide place a document on the projector. It was not from the file. It was a single page, a disclosure form. Oh. Stone's voice faltered as the image appeared on the screens behind him. He glanced at it, confused. Cain's voice cut. Through the air, devoid of all emotion, Congressman Stone, I'd like to direct your attention to the screen. This is your own public disclosure form from 2 years ago. Specifically, the section on spousal assets. Stone stared, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He didn't know where this was going, and now Cain continued as his aide switched. The image, this is a record from the state of Delaware showing the incorporation of a nonprofit foundation. The American Liberty Initiative, founder and director of which is your wife. Stone's face began to tighten. The smirk was gone. And this, Cain's voice was relentless, each word a hammer blow, is a list of the foundation's primary donors from its first year of operation. An interesting list. The top 3 donors are all executives at a single defense contractor, a contractor that, just months after these donations were made, was awarded a multi-billion-dollar no-bid contract that you, as a member of the Armed Services Committee, personally advocated for. A gasp went through the room. The press corps erupted into a frenzy of typing. Stone was frozen, his face a mask of disbelief, then rage. Cain had not used the innuendo from the file. He had found something harder, colder. A direct, documented line between money, family, and political influence. Congressman Stone, Cain said, his voice dropping to an almost conversational yet utterly menacing tone. You have spent the last 2 days speaking of ethics, of integrity. You have destroyed the reputation of a dedicated public servant over a private email. Perhaps you would now like to use your time to explain to the American people how your family's foundation received $1 million from a company you then helped to enrich with taxpayer money. Double quotes checkmate. Stone was undone. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a strangled noise came out. He was a brawler who had been expertly disarmed and exposed. He looked around at the faces of his colleagues, at the unblinking eyes of the cameras. There was no support, no escape. Kane had not just accused him of corruption, he had proven it, using Stone's own sanctimonious posturing as the backdrop. The hypocrisy was so stark, so blatant, it was indefensible. He grabbed his microphone, sputtering about smear campaigns, about desperate tactics from a failed chairman, but the words were hollow. Swagger was gone. He was no longer the fearsome populist warrior. It was just another crooked politician, caught with his hand in the cookie jar. The air had gone out of him. He had been publicly, surgically, and brutally humiliated. Kane sat back, allowing the scene to play out. He had won. He had destroyed his enemy. He had used Stone's own tactics against him and beaten him at his own game. But as he watched the wreck of a man at the other end of the dais, he felt no triumph, only a profound, chilling emptiness. He had descended into the mud. He had won the battle, but in doing so, he had become a part of the sickness he was trying to cure. The search for truth in the Damascus Protocol was now irrevocably tainted by his own calculated act of political assassination. And then, the twist, as Stone and his staff gathered their belongings in a chaotic, panicked retreat from the room, an aide from the majority side, a young, idealistic lawyer Kane had always admired for his quiet diligence, approached the dais. He looked pale, almost ill. He avoided Kane's eyes. He placed a single, unmarked manila envelope on the desk in front of the chairman. A reporter from the Post dropped this off, the aide mumbled. Said it was for you. Said you'd understand. The aide scurried away before Kane could ask any questions. Kane looked at the envelope. His name was not on it. There was only one word, typed in simple block letters. Zurich. A cold dread, far deeper than any he had felt before, washed over him. Zurich, the bank account from the Damascus Protocol. The key transaction he had challenged Stone to explain. His hands trembling slightly, he opened the envelope. Inside was not a document but a flash drive and a single folded piece of paper. He unfolded it. It was a printout of a bank transfer statement. The transfer was for $50,000, sent from an offshore account to a personal savings account in Virginia. He recognized the account number. Belonged to the young, idealistic aide who had just handed him the envelope. The date of the transfer was from 2 nights ago, the night after the first day of the hearing. The night he had sat in his office, contemplating his next move. The sender of the funds was a holding company. Kane didn't recognize the name, but he had a sickening premonition. He inserted the flash drive into his laptop, his fingers clumsy. The drive contained a single encrypted file. He knew the password. It was a code word his own investigative staff used for their most sensitive opposition research. He typed it in. The file opened. It was a trove of documents, a deep dark file. Not on Jed Stone, but on Alistair Kane himself. It contained every private email, every confidential memo, every off-the-record conversation he had ever had about the investigation. It included his team's private misgivings, their strategic debates, their unverified leads. It was the entire, unvarnished, and deeply compromising inside story of his crusade. At the very top of the file was a log, a communication log between the young aide and a burner phone that the log's metadata traced back to a location just 2 blocks from Jed Stone's district office. The truth hit Alistair Kane with the force of a physical blow. The brilliant, devastating takedown of Jed Stone, it hadn't been his own work. He hadn't found that thread connecting the defense contractor to the foundation on his own. The information had been fed to him, leaked. His own aide, the quiet, diligent one, had been Stone's mold all along. But it was even worse than that. The young man wasn't a cynical traitor. The flash drive also contained a personal manifesto, a raw, anguished confession. The aide had come to Washington believing in the cause, believing in Kane, but he had watched as the investigation became an obsession. As the pursuit of the former president became so all-consuming that Kane and his team began to cut corners, to entertain dubious sources, to leak to friendly press, to build momentum, The aide had come to believe that Cain's righteous crusade had become its own form of corruption. He hadn't gone to Stone to sabotage the investigation into the protocol. He had gone to Stone to sabotage Cain. He had leaked the details of Stone's own dirty laundry, knowing Stone's ego would never allow him to realize he was being played. The aide had baited a trap for Stone, using Cain as the trigger. His goal was to have them destroy each other, to expose the hypocrisy and rot on both sides. The payment to his account was his 30 pieces of silver, a final act of self-immolation. Proof of his own corruption to ensure the whole edifice came crashing down. Alistair Cain stared at the screen, the hearing room silent around him. He had not been a brilliant tactician. He had been a puppet. His great triumphant victory was a lie, orchestrated by a disillusioned subordinate who had used his own self-righteousness against him. Jed Stone's fall from grace was real, but it was a symptom of a deeper disease. The unresolved dilemma was staggering. Cain now held the evidence of a profound crime outlined in the Damascus Protocol, but he also held the evidence that his entire investigation was built on a foundation of lies, leaks, and manipulation. Some of them his own, many of them perpetrated against him by his own team. To proceed would be to build a case for the rule of law on a bedrock of lawlessness. To stop would be to let the powerful escape justice. He looked at the empty chairs, the impassive marble walls. He had wanted to restore faith in the institution. Instead, he had exposed its terminal illness. His fall from grace was not public like Stone's. It was a silent, internal collapse. He had won the battle, lost the war, and in the process, realized he was fighting on the wrong side of his own integrity. The truth of the Damascus Protocol was sitting on his desk, but the cost of revealing it was now the truth about himself. And he was no longer sure which was more damning,